Hey, this is Stephen and Jen with Iowa Backyard Farmer. Today we're talking about
When should I plant my seeds?
it feels like every January rolls around and we're after Christmas and it just feels like it ought to be spring, but it isn't yet. But I have seeds. And so when can I plant them? That's what we're going to figure out. First thing we need to do is figure out your frost date.
So you can Google search with your zip code, and there are a number of sites that will show you what your last frost date is. Here's one that we find particularly useful, happens to be on Dave's Garden website. One of the things that we really like about this one is it doesn't just give a single last frost date, it gives us a range of last frost date based on the frequency over the last 30 years of when that last frost date occurred. So in our zip code, we popped up a couple of them. Here on the left, we've got Ankeny, which is the town that we live in, and then Des Moines, which is just to the south of us over here on the right side. So if we use Des Moines as an example, we'll talk through how you can read this chart. And we're going to assume that we are concerned about the temperature dropping below 32 degrees. So we'll use this top line here. So as we go across it, I'm actually going to start from the right and work to the left. So under 90%, we have an April 8th date. That means 90% of the time, there will be a 32-degree frost after April 8th. If we move over to the 70%, that means that 70% of the time, we will have a frost of 32 degrees or colder after April 15th. And coming on over to, let's say, the 30 percentile, or the 30% number, that means 30% of the years we will have a frost after April 25th. So the question is, when is your last frost date? If you're only willing to take very little risk and you want to make sure and be absolutely positive, you're going to plant after May 2nd.
Around here, a lot of people who've gardened a long time just say Mother's Day. You're pretty safe at Mother's Day, and there won't be a late frost. Not always, but pretty safe. Pretty safe. So the next question is,
how much risk can you tolerate? As we look across that series of dates, do you really need to wait until May? Do you want to wait till May? Maybe you're a type of personality that wants to accept a little bit more risk and plant a little bit earlier.
And we like to stretch the harvest out as far as we can. So we're guilty of planting a little earlier and trying to squeeze in a few extra things.
And some years we succeed by doing that. Some years we regret it.
Yeah, last year, point in case, we sell plants in the spring, and I had planted all these beautiful cabbages and chard and things to sell, but I got anxious and I wanted to plant them outside. And so I planted some outside, and the ones that stayed inside got bigger.
Yeah. So really the questions to ask yourself when you want to measure your level of risk, are you willing to watch the weather? If you plant something out early, are you going to watch the weather? Are you set up to be able to cover those plants? If not, can you afford to lose those and replant later? Or do you have a greenhouse and maybe you can do a few things a little different if you've got a greenhouse?
That having a greenhouse probably makes the biggest difference in our setup here, because you cannot keep everything under little bitty grow lights for a long time. But what we can do is that we can start with little 72 cell flats of tomatoes and peppers, and then we plant them up and put them out in the greenhouse, and then we have space under the lights for something else. It's, again, you have to gamble with the weather because it's not cheap to run those propane heaters, is it, Stephen?
So nope, we do go through a lot of propane to keep things heated in the greenhouse. If we do get a cool stretch after we put those out, it certainly is worth it. The plants do grow extra, well with the sunlight that they get by being in the greenhouses, but it does cost more to be able to heat them. And there's other risk as well. If the heater goes off in the middle of a cold night, we could risk losing an entire greenhouse. So we are really, really careful. Don't sleep a whole lot
during those cold weather. We haven't lost any plants to cold, but you've lost a whole lot of sleep to
that is
cold,
true,
because you're the one in charge of making sure my greenhouses stay warm overnight. But you can see in that picture that by the time we get to May, that's a tomato plant that we started in the lights in about beginning of March, first week of March, and now it is about 18 inches tall, getting ready to go out into the garden, and it's all ready. And so you can extend that that window. And another thing you can do planting in waves is that you'll notice we're going to go to a seed starting calculator in just a minute, but a lot of the plants that we like to start early can actually go out before that frost date. And so that frost date it's a wiggly line to start with. And then you add on that some plants, peas and onions and celery and things, can be planted, potatoes, before that last frost date.
Yep. So after you've assessed your situation and determined your level of risk, then it's time to find a planting calculator. And there are a number of online calculators that you can go to. One of our favorite ones is on the Johnny Seeds website. We buy a lot of seed from them, and have found that their tools that they have are very helpful. So if you go to their website, you can click on their grower library. And then coming over here on the left-hand side, select planting tools and calculators.
You'll have to scroll down a little ways, but then you'll find this one that we've got circled. It's called Seed Starting Date Calculator for Seedlings, and it is a cool calculator.
So once you get here, you need to enter up here towards the top the date that you're considering your frost-free date.
Yeah, remember back when we calculated your level of risk, what day are you deciding is the day that you're going to be ready to plant? And you enter that right in here in this spot. Otherwise, all your numbers, you can see this one defaulted to today. And so it has me planting my broccoli November 28th because it thinks I have a different zone than I am. So that was important. Remember to hit enter.
Yeah. So in our examples in the next couple of screens, we chose May 6th.
May 6th.
As our example date.
Which is a pretty safe date. And we probably, because we have a greenhouse, for us, we will choose an earlier date just because we can move things to the greenhouse. But if you're starting and all you have is little grow lights and then they're going to go to the garden, I would choose a safe day like March or May 7th or 6th if you're in central Iowa.
Yep. And so we use May 6th for this. And then the nice thing about this calculator is it lists a lot of different crops. And you can only see a few of them here on this screen, but we've got the crops. And then the next column over is the number of weeks to start your seeds inside before setting them out. And that can range from 2 or 3 weeks up to 8 to 10 weeks, depending on the crop.
And we're getting close to that 10, 12 weeks here. If you're trying to plant onions, they should be in the ground or in your growing now. If you've got things that are going to take that long time, some of those things will be going now and some of them won't be for a while.
Yeah. So the next couple of columns are really the planting window for that crop. And so on here, we've got eggplant, for example, that says you could plant starting, March 11th all the way through April 1st. The next column over says essentially when should you plan on planting compared to your frost date that you had entered. And
so you'll notice the eggplants like it warm. And so they're saying I picked May 6th, and they're saying, I don't want to be planted for 2 to 3 more weeks. Thank you. So you can plan on planting me in the garden around the 20th to 27th of May. They don't want to be hurried.
Yep.
On the other hand, you have things like kohlrabi that you can plant clear here in February and plant 4 weeks before the last frost. Or lettuce. Lettuce is the same. You can plant it out before that frost date, sometime in the middle of April. It likes the cold weather.
Yep. If we scroll on down, one of our favorites, of course, is tomatoes. Tomatoes you plant 6 to 8 weeks before you would want to set them out. And so when you start them inside, according to the dates we have entered in here, you would start those seeds between March 18th and April 8th. And then tomatoes do like it warmer, and so you set them out or plant them out into the garden a week or two after that last frost date.
Yeah, for our plant sales, we really target that Mother's Day weekend and later. You have to really be watching the weather if you're going to do too much before then. Speaking of weather, this was last year. You say this is my in the garden greenhouse on the left. And you can see that we just built it over the T-frames. It's a really efficient thing that held all our peppers this year. And it's a beautiful April day here. Let's see if it'll play for me. fabulous. And then here's April 15th, just a day or two later. Oh, and there's 4 inches of snow. We're so excited.
And the snow doesn't bother us because everything that we have are in our different greenhouses that are kept warm by propane heaters.
You can see those propane heaters glowing here. You can see those from our room, and Steven stays up long nights trying to make sure that they're all still going. They're all still going. So what do you plant? What order do we plant in? How do we decide what to plant? What's worth it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my ideal world, we would have enough grow lights and heat mats to start everything inside.
I've tried.
But unfortunately, we don't have.
And we have a pretty good setup. I will say we start a lot of stuff. But seeds are little, seed packets are little, but the tomatoes and all those things, they grow. I promise they get bigger and they get taller, and they will overrun you if you're not careful.
Yep. So when you try to determine if you don't have all the grow light space that you wish you did, how are you going to prioritize what to plant? And my key thing is to say, when you plant your seeds early, what you're buying is both time and space. And remembering that is critical as you try to determine what your priorities are going to be to plant. So when I talk about time, let's use tomatoes as an example. If you plant those inside 6 to 8 weeks before planting them outside, you'll
just saved yourself 2 months of growing time.
Yeah, basically, compared to seeding that outside, you now have 6 to 8 weeks of additional harvest time, which can be pretty significant. In terms of buying space, if you plant your tomatoes 2 feet apart, for example, and you were to seed them outside, and let's say only 70% of the seeds germinated, you've got spots and holes in your garden that are not being used because the seeds didn't germinate. But when you transplant new plants outside, you know that each of those is going to survive and you have no empty spots in your garden.
Well, and a lot of the time we can intercrop those too. By the time we put our tomatoes in last year, we'd already had 2 harvests in that space, because you can put little spring onions or radishes. We had strawberries under there. They were all done by the time we planted out the tomatoes.
Yeah, so really, if you're limited in your space underneath your grow lights, I focus on those things that are just simply too long season to grow from seed outside. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, onions are all examples of plants that just really need to be started indoors first.
And what about pumpkins?
Pumpkins. So pumpkins, you get 2 to 3 weeks by planting them inside. One of the nice things you get by starting your pumpkins inside is really a jump start on the insects. So if you have a garden that the squash bugs seem to like, or the squash vine borers seem to like, you get an extra 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 weeks head start ahead of the insects, which can make the difference between getting a crop and not getting a crop.
Yeah, you can always buy a treated seed or something, but we've chosen not to do that. So we try and fool the insects a different way, which is good. You can also get a really good head start on cold crops. I like putting out, again, to your space point, it's not always effective to plant out seeds of greens and lettuces and things because they get washed away or it's cold and it's just not consistent in the spring. But if I put out those little starts, they like the cool weather. We've got them spaced just right. And usually I can put them in the garden and then still have space under those grow lights to plant something else, like those pumpkins, which should not be started with your tomatoes because they grow much faster. You need to wait on those until like the middle of April.
Yeah, we've made that mistake before, thinking, oh gosh, we really need to, I think it's going to be an early spring. Let's get our pumpkins planted inside. And then we get a cool stretch and we've got pumpkin vines that are 2.5 feet long spreading out underneath our grow lights. And yeah, they're just not happy when they get that big.
They are not. So in order of what we plant, we're going to start with those long season things like onions and leeks and some of those herbs that take a really long time. Hot peppers are going to take a long time. Those will start first. And about March, the middle of March, we're going to plant those tomatoes and peppers and broccoli and eggplant, all those, your main season crops. And then in April, just a few weeks before your last frost date, because they like it warm, are going to be all your melons and squashes and cucumbers and all those things.
Yep. And if you simply just rent out a room, There are some of the larger seeded varieties that do just fine if they're seeded directly out into the garden. For example, beans, peas, squashes, melons, and cucumbers, they'll be fine if they're seeded directly out in the garden. You do get a jump start if you do start them inside under the lights, but they'll still be okay.
Yeah, they're
It-
fast growing. They'll make up some good time, and they really like it warm. They really don't want you to rush them
Yeah,
with cold soil. They will not be happy if you just plant them early outside,
yeah, that's for
and they
sure.
won't be happy if they plant them early under the lights either.
Nope. But there are other things that you should avoid would be, I'll say some of the root crops, stuff like beets and carrots and radishes, turnips, those kinds of things. They just, they don't transplant very well. So assuming you're a little limited on space underneath the grow lights, those are things that I would just hold off and plant directly into the ground.
Fortunately, a lot of those things can take the cold, and if you're anxious to get a garden, those carrots and beets and radishes can go into the ground pretty early. They don't mind a little cold.
Yep.
Well, I think that's all for now. If you have any thoughts or questions, leave them in the comments below. We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.